Thank you. All right, thank you for being here and participating in this colloquium. So I'll tell you about some of the things that are happening in deep learning, but I only have 30 minutes, so I'll be kind of quickly going through some subjects and some challenges for scaling up deep learning towards AI. Hopefully you'll have chances to ask me questions during the panel that follows. Oh, one thing I want to mention is I'm writing a book. It's called Deep Learning, and you can already download most of the chapters, at least the draft versions of the chapters from my webpage. It's going to be an MIT Press book, hopefully next year. Right. So what is deep learning, and why is everybody excited about it? First of all, deep learning is just an approach to machine learning, and what's particular about it, as Terry was saying, it's inspired by brains. We're trying to understand some of the principles, computational and mathematical principles, that could explain the kind of intelligence based on learning that we see in brains. But from a computer science perspective, the idea is that these algorithms learn representations. So representation is a central concept in deep learning. And of course, the idea of learning representations is actually not new, and it was part of the deal of the original neural nets, like the Boltzmann machine and the backprop from the 80s. But what's new here, and what happened about 10 years ago, is a breakthrough that allowed us to train deeper neural networks, meaning that have multiple levels of representation. And why is that interesting? So earlier I mentioned that there are some theoretical results showing that you can represent some complicated functions that are the result of the many levels of compositions efficiently with these deep networks, whereas in general, you won't be able to represent these kinds of functions with a shallow network that doesn't have enough levels. What does it mean to have more depth? It means that you're able to represent more abstract concepts. And these more abstract concepts allow these machines to generalize better. So that's the essence of what's going on here. All right, so the breakthrough happened in 2006, where for the first time we were able to train these deeper networks, and we used unsupervised learning for that. But it took a few years before these advances made their way to industry and to large-scale applications. So it started around 2010 with speech recognition. By 2012, if you had an Android phone like this, well, you had neural nets doing speech recognition in them. And now, of course, it's everywhere for speech. It's changed the field of speech recognition. Everybody uses it, essentially. And then about 2 years later, 2012, there was another breakthrough using convolutional networks, which are a particular kind of deep networks that had been around for a long time, but that have been improved using some of the techniques we discovered along these in recent years. Really allowed us to make big impact in the field of computer vision and object recognition in particular. So I'm sure Fei will say a few words later about that event and then the role of the ImageNet dataset in this. But what's going on now is that neural nets are going beyond their traditional realm of perception, and people are exploring how to use them for understanding language. And of course, we haven't yet solved that problem. But this is where a lot of the action is now, and of course continues a lot of research and R&D in computer vision, and now, for example, expanding to video and many other areas. But I'm particularly interested in the expansion of this field in natural language. There are other areas. You've heard about reinforcement learning. There is a lot of action there, robotics, control. So many areas of AI are now more and more seeing the potential gain coming from using these more abstract systems. So today I'm going to go through three of the main challenges that I see for bringing deep learning as we know it today closer to AI. One of them is computational. And of course, for a company like IBM and other companies that build machines, this is an important challenge. It's an important challenge because what we've observed is that the bigger the models we're able to train, given the amount of data we currently have, the better they are. And so, we can just keep building bigger models, and hopefully we're going to continue improving. Now, that being said, I think it's not going to be enough. So there are other challenges, and one of them I mentioned has to do with understanding language. But understanding language actually requires something more. It requires a form of reasoning. So people are starting to use these recurrent nets you heard about, recurrent networks that can be very deep in some sense when you consider time, in order to combine different pieces of evidence in order to provide answers to questions, and essentially displayed in different forms of reasoning. So I'll say a few words about that challenge. And finally, maybe one of the most important challenges that's maybe more fundamental even, is the unsupervised learning challenge. So up to now, all of the industrial applications of deep learning have exploited supervised learning, where we have labeled the data. We've said in that image there's a cat, in that image there's a desk, and so on. But there's a lot more data that we could take advantage of that's unlabeled, and that's going to be important because all of that information that we need to build these AIs it has to come from somewhere, and we need enough data, and most of it is not going to be labeled. Right, so as I mentioned, and I guess as my colleague Ilya Sutskever from Google keeps saying, bigger is better. At least up to now, we haven't seen the limitations. I do believe that there are obstacles, and bigger is not going to be enough. But clearly, there's an easy path forward with the current algorithms, just by making our neural nets 100 times faster and bigger. And so, why is that? Basically, what I see in many experiments with neural nets right now is that I'm going to use some jargon here, they underfit, meaning that they're not big enough, or we don't train them long enough for them to exploit all of the information that there is in the data. And so they're not even able to learn the data by heart, right? Which is the thing we usually want to avoid in machine learning, but that comes almost for free with these networks. And so we just have to press on the pedal of more capacity, and we're almost sure to get an improvement here. All right, to just illustrate graphically that we have some room to approach the size of human brains, this picture was made up by my former students, Ian Goodfellow, where we see the sizes of different organisms and neural nets over the years. So the DBN here was from 2006. The AlexNet is the breakthrough network of 2012 for computer vision, and the AtomNet is maybe a couple of years old. So we see that the current technology is, maybe between a bee and a frog in terms of size of the networks for about the same number of synapses. So we've almost reached the kind of average number of synapses you see in actual brains, between 1,000 and 10,000. But in terms of number of neurons, we're several orders of magnitude away. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a stream of research we've been pushing in my lab, which is more connected to the computing challenge and potential hardware implementation, which is can we train neural nets that have very low precision? So we had a first paper at ICLR. But by the way, ICLR is the deep learning conference, and it happens every year now. Jan Lequin and I started it in 2013, and it's been an amazing success that year and every year since then. We can have a third version next May. And so we wanted to know how many bits do you actually require? And of course, people have been asking these kinds of questions for decades. But using sort of the current state-of-the-art neural nets. And and we found 12, and I can show you some pictures how we got these numbers on different data sets, and comparing different ways of representing numbers with fixed point or dynamic fixed point. And also depending on where you use those bits, you actually need less bits in the activations than in the weights, so you need more precision in the weights. So that was the first investigation, but then we thought, okay, so that's the for the weights, that's the number of bits you actually need to keep the information that you're accumulating from many examples. But when you actually run your system during training, especially, maybe you don't need all those bits. Maybe you can get the same effect by introducing noise and discretizing randomly those weights to +1 or -1. So that's exactly what we did. The idea is, the cute idea here is that we can replace a real number by a binary number that has the same expected value by, sampling those two values with a probability such that the expected value is the correct one. And now, instead of having a real number to multiply, we have a bit to multiply, which is easy. It's just an addition. And why would we do that? Because we want to get rid of multiplications. Multiplications is what takes up most of the surface area on chips for doing, neural nets. So we had a first try at this, and this is going to be presented at the next SNPs in just a few weeks in Montreal. And it allows us to get rid of the multiplications in the feed-forward computation and in the backward computation where we compute gradients. But we remained with the multiplication, because even if you discretize the weights, there's another multiplication at the end of the backprop where you multiply, you don't multiply weights, you multiply activations and gradients. And so if those two things are real valued, you still need a regular multiplication. So so that's going to be in the NIPS paper. But the new thing we did is to get rid of that last multiplication that we need for the update of the weights. So the delta W is a change in the weights, dCdA is the gradient that's propagated back, and H is the activations. It's some jargon, but anyway, we have to do this multiplication. So, well, the only thing we need to do is take one of these two numbers and replace it again by a stochastic quantity that is not going to require multiplication. So instead of binarizing it, we quantize it stochastically to its mantissa. In other words, we get rid of to its exponent. We get rid of the mantissa. In other words, we represent it. We represent it in a log scale. So if you do that again, you can map the activations to some values that are just powers of 2, and now multiplication is just addition. This is an old trick. I mean, the trick of using powers of 2 is an old trick. The new trick is to do this stochastically so that you actually get the right things in average, and stochastic gradient works perfectly fine. And so, we are running some experiments on a few data sets showing that you get a bit of a slowdown because of the extra noise, but so the green and yellow curve here are with this trick with binarized weights and stochastically quantized activations. And the good news is, well, it learns even better actually because this noise acts as a regularizer. Now this is pretty good news. Now why is this interesting? It's interesting because we can probably, for two reasons. One is for hardware implementations, this could be useful. The other reason is that it connects with what the brain with spikes, right? So the idea you can think of, if I go back here, when you replace activations by some stochastic binary values that have the right expected value, you're introducing noise, but you're actually not changing that much the computation of the gradient. And so it would be reasonable for brains to use the same trick if they could save on the hardware side. Okay, so now let me move on to my second challenge, which has to do with language, and in particular language understanding. There's a lot of work to do in this direction, but the progress in the last few years is pretty impressive. Actually, I was part of the the beginning of that process of extending the realm of application of neural networks to language. And so in 2000, we had a NIPS paper where we introduced the idea of learning to represent probability distributions over sequences of words. In other words, being able to generate sequences of words that look like English by decomposing the problem in two parts. And that's a kind of a central element that you find in neural nets and especially in deep learning, which is think of the problem not as going directly from inputs to outputs, but breaking the problem into two parts. One is the representation part. So learning to represent words here by mapping each word to a fixed size real valued vector, and then taking those representations and mapping them to the answers you care about. And here that's predicting the next word. It turned out that those representations of words that we learned have incredibly nice properties, and they capture a lot of the semantic aspects of words. And there's been tons and tons of papers to analyze these things, to use them in applications. So these are called word vectors or word embeddings, and they're used all over the place and becoming like commonplace in natural language processing. In the last couple of years, there's been a kind of exciting observation about these word embeddings, which is that they capture analogies, even though they were not programmed for that. So what do I mean? What I mean is that if you take the vector, which is for each word, and you do operations on them like subtract and add them, you can get interesting things coming up. So for example, if you take the vector for queen and you subtract the vector for king, you get a new vector, and that vector is pretty much aligned with the vector that you get from subtracting the representation for woman from the representation for man. And so that means that you could do something like woman minus man plus king and get queen, right? So it can answer the question, you know, what is to king what woman is to man, and it would find queen. So that's interesting, and there's you know, some nice explanations that we're starting to understand why this is happening. But basically, directions in that space of representations correspond to attributes that have been discovered by the machine. So here, the difference between man and woman, they have all the same attributes somehow in some space, some semantic space, except for gender. And the same is true for queen and king. They have lots of different attributes, but they essentially have all the same except for gender. And so when you subtract them, the only thing you get in your hand is the direction for gender. Okay, so the progress with representing the meaning of words has been really amazing, but of course this is by no means sufficient to understand language. And so the next stage has been, well, can we represent the meaning of sentences or phrases? And in my group, we worked on machine translation as a case study to see if we could, you know, bring up that power of representation that we've seen in those language models to a task that was a bit more challenging from a semantic point of view. I guess the thing we're doing now, and many other groups are also doing, is pushing that to an even harder semantic task, which is question answering. In other words, read a sentence or read a paragraph or a document, and then read a question, and then generate in natural language an answer. So it's a bit more challenging, but you can see that it's a kind of translation as well. You have a sequence in input, and you produce a sequence in output. In fact, we use very similar techniques. So now let me tell you about that machine translation approach that we created about a year and a half ago. It uses these recurrent networks that you've heard about, because as soon as you start dealing with sequences, it's kind of the natural thing to do. And it uses something fairly new that has been incredibly successful in the field in the last year, which is the idea of introducing attention mechanisms within the computation. So sometimes we think of attention as like visual attention, so deciding where to look. But here we're talking about a different kind of attention. It's a kind of internal attention, so choosing which parts of your neural network you're going to be paying attention to. And here, let me go through this architecture a little bit. What's going on is, do I have a pointer? All right. you have an input sentence in English, say, and there's a recurrent net that reads it, meaning it sees one word at a time, and as it goes through it, it builds a representation of the words that it has seen. Actually, there are two recurrent nets, one reading from left to right and the other from right to left. And then at each position, you have a representation of what's going on around that word. So that's the reading network. Then there is an output network, which is going to produce a sequence of words. More precisely, it's going to produce a probability distribution for each word in the vocabulary at each stage. And then we're going to pick, according to the distribution, we're going to pick the next word. And that the choice of that word is going to condition the computation for the next stage. The state of the network is going to be different depending on what words you've said before. And that whole output sequence is going to be influenced by what we have read, of course, because we want to translate the input sequence. Now, the way that input sequence and that output sequence are related is important. That's where the attention mechanism comes in. Because when you're doing translation, for example, the input sequence has a different length from the output sequence. So which word or which part of the sequence here corresponds to which part in the output sequence? That's the question that the attention mechanism is helping us figure out. And we found a way to do that using a mechanism that allows us to train using normal techniques with backprop. We can compute exact gradients through this process. And the idea is that for each position in the output sequence, our network looks in the input sequence at all possible positions and computes a weight, and it's going to multiply the representation it's getting at each position by that weight to form a linear combination, which is going to be a context that's going to drive the update at the next stage. So in a sense, you're choosing where to look at each stage to decide what the next word is going to be. So this has actually worked incredibly well, and in the space of 1 year, we went from dismal performance to state-of-the-art performance, and at the last WMT 2015, we got the first place on 2 of the language pairs, English to German and English to Czech. And I'm sure, and now there's like a bunch of groups around the world that are pushing, these kinds of systems. So this is kind of a new way of doing machine translation, which is very, very different in nature from the state-of-the-art that's been around for 20 years. So the next thing we did is use almost the same code for translating not from English to French, but from French to English, but from image to English. So the idea is it's almost the same architecture, except that instead of having a recurrent network that reads the French sentence, we have what's called a convolutional net that we've heard about that looks at the image and computes for each location or for each block of pixels a feature vector, again a representation. Similarly, that we had representations for words. Now we have representations for parts of the image, and then the attention mechanism, as it generates the words in the sentence that it's producing, at each stage chooses where to look in the image. So Terry showed you some pictures from my lab. You've seen this. And what we see with each pair of images is on the left, the image that the system sees as input. On the right, we see where it's putting its attention for a particular word. That's the word that's underlined. So when it says a little girl, we see that it's putting attention around the face of the girl. The other one on top, for example, a woman is throwing a frisbee in the park. So the underlined word is frisbee, and we show in the second image in the pair where it's putting its attention in the image. So these are cases where it works quite well, but it wouldn't be fair if I only showed you those cases. I need to show you those where it fails. So here are examples where it fails, and that's where we learn the most. First of all, you realize immediately that we haven't solved AI, and that it's making mistakes both on the visual side and on the language side. So on the visual side, you see things like on the top left, it thinks that it's a bird. It's 2 giraffes. I mean, if you squint, maybe you can think of it's a bird. And the second one, it thinks that the round shape on the shirt is a clock, which again, if you squint, you might think it's a clock. But Now, the third one is totally crazy. A man wearing a hat and a hat on a skateboard. So it's wrong, visually it's wrong, linguistically you wouldn't do a hat and a hat, and so on. So it's fun and instructive to use these attention mechanisms to understand what's going on inside the machine, to see, at each step of the computation, what was it paying attention to. So it's pretty interesting. And now it turns out that this attention mechanism is at the heart of another revolution that's going on right now in deep learning that has to do with the notion of memory that Terry also mentioned during the panel. Neural nets up to recently have been considered as purely sort of pattern recognition devices that go from input to output. As soon as you start thinking about dealing with reasoning and sequential processing, comes the idea that it would be nice to have a short-term memory or even a long-term memory that is different from the straight sort of representation building computation that we have in those feed-forward neural nets. And so the idea is that in addition to the recurrent net that does the usual computation, we have a memory. So here, each of the cells, think of it as a memory cell. And, a memory needs simple concepts like where are you going to be reading and writing and what are you going to be reading and writing. And so we can generalize these concepts to neural nets that you can train by backprop by saying that at each time step, you basically have a different probability of choosing where to read and where to write. And then you're going to put something there with some weight that's proportional to that probability. So these kinds of systems, they started less than a year ago, at about the same time, from a group in Facebook and a group at DeepMind, using the same kind of attention mechanism that we had proposed just a few months earlier. And so they're able to do things like this, like read sentences like this and answer questions. So Joe went to the garden and Fred picked up the milk. Joe moved to the bathroom and Fred dropped the milk, and then Dan moved to the living room. Where's Dan? You're not supposed to read the answer. Or other things like I have other examples down there, like Sam walks into the kitchen. Sam picks up an apple. Sam walks to the bedroom. Sam drops the apple. Where is the apple? So these are the kinds of things that we're able to do now. Of course, these are toy problems, but it's not something we would imagine just a few years ago that neural nets would be able to do. So by using recurrence and by using new architectures that allow these recurrent nets to keep information for a longer time, so dealing with this challenge that's called long-term dependencies, we are able to push the scope of applications of deep learning well beyond what was thought possible just a few years ago. So in my lab, we're working on using these ideas for knowledge extraction. So the idea is to be able to read pages in Wikipedia and fill that memory with representations, semantic representations for nuggets of facts that can be then used to answer questions. And of course, if we can do that, that would be extremely useful. Yes, I'm going to skip that and just use a little bit of time for the last challenge, which is maybe the most difficult one and has to do with how computers could form these abstractions without being told ahead of time a lot of the details of what they should be in the first place. So that's what unsupervised learning is about. And I mentioned that unsupervised learning is important because we can take advantage of all of the knowledge implicitly stored in lots and lots of data that hasn't been tagged and labeled by humans. But there are also reasons why it could be interesting for other applications in machine learning. For example, in the case of structured outputs, where you want the machine to produce something that is not a yes or a no, or it's not a category, but it's something more complicated, like an image. Maybe you want to transform an image, or you want to produce a sentence like you've seen before. It's also interesting because if you start thinking about how machines could eventually reach the kind of level of performance of humans, we have to admit that in terms of learning ability, we're very, very far from humans. Humans are able to learn from very few examples a new task. Right now, if you take a machine learning system out of the box, it's going to take, it's going to need, depending on the task, maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of examples before you get a decent performance. Humans can learn a new task with just a handful or sometimes even a single example or even 0 examples. You don't even give them an example, you give them a linguistic description of the task, right? So we're thinking, what are plausible ways that we could address this? And it also has to do with the notion of representation that's been central to what I've been telling you about. And now we're thinking about how those representations, become meaningful as explanations for the data. In other words, what are the explanatory factors that explain the variations we see in the data? And that's what unsupervised learning is after. It's trying to discover representations where each element of the representation you can think of as a factor or a cause that could explain the things we're seeing. So in 2011, we participated in a couple of scientific challenges on transfer learning, where the idea is you're seeing examples from some tasks, maybe they're labeled, but the end goal is to actually use the representation that you've learned to do a good job on new tasks for which you have very few labeled examples. And basically what we found is that when you use these unsupervised learning methods, you're able to generalize much faster with very few labeled examples. So all these curves have on the x-axis the log of the number of labeled examples, and on the y-axis accuracy. As you build deeper systems that learn actually in an unsupervised way from all the other tasks, but just looking at the input distribution, you're able on the new tasks to extract information from the very few examples you have much faster. Faster meaning you need less examples to get high accuracy. That's what these curves tell us. Now, there are really big challenges to, why is it that unsupervised learning hasn't been as successful as supervised learning, at least as we look at the current industrial applications of deep learning. And I think it's because there are really hard fundamental challenges, because you're trying to model something that's much higher dimensional. When you're doing supervised learning, usually the output is a small object, it's in one category or something like that. In unsupervised learning, you're trying to characterize a number of configurations of these variables that's exponentially large, and for a number of mathematical reasons, that makes the sort of more natural approaches based on probabilities automatically intractable for reasons that I won't have time to explain in detail. But there has been a lot of research recently to try to bypass these limitations, these intractabilities. And what's amazing about the research currently in unsupervised learning is that there's like 10 different ways of doing unsupervised learning. There's not one way. It's not like the supervised learning where we have basically backprop with small variations. Here we have totally different learning principles that go and try to bypass in different ways the problems with maximum likelihood and probabilistic modeling. So it's moving pretty fast. Just a few years ago, we were not able to generate, for example, images of anything but digits, images of digits, black and white. So, just last year we were able to move to sort of more realistic digits. These are images of street view house numbers that were generated by some of these recent algorithms. And these are more natural images that were generated by a paper presented just a few months ago, where the scientists who did this at Facebook and NYU asked humans whether the images were natural or not. So is this coming from the machine or is this coming from real world? And it turned out that 40% of the images generated by the computer were fooling the human. So you're kind of almost passing the Turing test here. Now these are a particular class of images, but still that's there's a lot of progress, and so it's very encouraging. One thing I'm interested in is the last bit here. As we are exploring all of these different approaches to unsupervised learning, some of these look like they might also explain how brains do it. And I think that is a very interesting source of inspiration for this research. All right, so why isn't it interesting to do unsupervised learning? As I mentioned, because it goes at the heart of what deep learning is about, which is to allow the computer to discover good representations, more abstract representations. So what does it mean to be more abstract? It means that we essentially go to the heart of the explanations of what's going on behind the data. Of course, that's the dream, right? And we can measure that. We can do experiments where we can see that the computer automatically discovers in its hidden units features that we haven't programmed explicitly in, but that are perfectly, capturing some of the factors that are present as we know them. So, yeah, I'm going to close there and show you pictures of the current state of my lab, which is growing too fast. Thank you.